To get started, my name is Brian Newhare. I serve as the Dean for the College of Rural and Community Development here, or CRCD for short. And I want to thank you all for gathering with us today for our last of the academic year CRCD Research Speaker Series, which highlights our amazing and diverse faculty, research, and projects. And the series focuses on community-based research, Indigenous knowledge in academia, and best practices for ethical research. So for today's presentation, we're super excited to feature faculty from our community-based sciences department and the Northwest campus, Associate Professor Dr. Claudia Ihl. So Dr. Ihl grew up in Germany and first came to Alaska when she rode a bike from San Francisco to Fairbanks. She then went on to receive a Master's of Science and a PhD in biology from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Claudia has studied muskoxen in the Northwest Alaska for both her degrees and in her current position as Associate Professor of Biology at the Northwest campus in Nome. Claudia has also worked with captive muskoxen at the Large Animal Research Station here in Fairbanks while she was a graduate student. And in Nome, Claudia teaches a variety of classes and involves rural students in her research on muskoxen. So Claudia's current project focuses on the increasing problem of muskoxen, which invade the city limits of Nome. The exact reasons for the strange behavior are elusive, but Claudia believes that the habitat created by human activities such as mining plays a deciding role. So just on the technical side, please keep your videos and microphones off during the duration of the presentation to limit distractions and internet issues. Again, if we're going to try and do the speaker view on the back end, but if it doesn't work for you, top right-hand corner view, hit the speaker button, and that should put Claudia and her presentation forward. After the presentation, please submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And this presentation is being recorded and will be published to the CRCD website following the event. So without further ado, I'm very excited to hear Claudia's presentation. So the floor is yours.
All right. Yes, thanks everybody for coming. So can everybody see the screen right now with my first slide on there?
Yes, you are good to go.
Okay, so I called this "Why did the muskox cross the road?" because that's what they're frequently doing these days in Nome. If you come to Nome in the summer months, you'll see scenes like these, muskoxen in the middle of the road, muskoxen walking through the neighborhood, and all kinds of things. So, and I'll present some of the data we have so far. We don't have all of the data yet. The project is still in progress, so more of them are coming. So I'll just show you what we have so far. Let's start out just for those of you who are not that familiar with muskoxen. What is a muskox anyway? This is, it's a very misnomed animal. It's not actually really an ox. It's much closer related to goats and sheep. And it doesn't really have musk glands either. I think it was first named in French, bœuf musqué, by possibly a Frenchman who stood downwind of a rutting muskox bull or something. They do tend to be a bit smelly when they're in rut, so maybe that's where it came from. But it's really close to the Latin name ovibos, sheep cow, really is a bit closer to the truth because they're more closely related to goats and sheep. And you probably have heard that muskoxen are, were part of the Ice Age fauna. This is sort of an idea of what the Ice Age scenario might have looked like around the Bering Strait about 15,000 years ago or so. Lots of animals that are extinct today. The muskoxen, I had to look for them a little. They're just the tiny little bits down here are to the modern muskoxen, which is still around. There were also other species of muskoxen here, a taller one, a larger one, and then, horses, mammoths, bison, things that are all extinct today. This is a cave painting from Lascaux and actually from Chauvet, the Chauvet cave in France, where Ice Age hunters have mostly painted other animals, but a few muskoxen are in there as well. They've been around for a long time. I put this slide in because these days I often hear people say in Nome, oh, well, they don't really belong here anyway, right? They were reintroduced. They're not really part of the Alaskan fauna. But the truth is they've been in Alaska a very long time. The genus Ovibos is probably about 2 million years old. It's about the same as our own genus, Homo. And muskoxen have been in Alaska for probably at least 150,000 years. They came over the Bering Land Bridge like so many other of these large animals. In comparison, our species, Homo sapiens, 150,000 years ago, I don't think we've even left Africa by then. I think we were all still hunting rhinos in Central Africa, Equatorial Africa. So they've been in Alaska a very long time. So I never really quite like it when they're called Ice Age relics. It seems to be sort of a cliched way of, I don't know, it kind of sticks to them. You know, if you read anything about muskoxen online, the word Ice Age relic always comes up. But the word relic always implies that they're just not really supposed to be around anymore. They're supposed to have gone extinct like all these other animals. But they're very much around, and they're very much an animal of our time, and they've been here for a very long time. So here's a little bit of an idea of where we find muskoxen. This is a circumpolar map. So the North Pole would be in the middle here. Here's North America. Here's Asia. Here's Norway and Sweden. And these hatched areas are areas where original muskox populations still persist and where they haven't died out. So at the beginning of the 1900s, these were the only areas, or even just some of these, where muskoxen still existed. And the Canadian government put them under protection at that point, one of the very early successes of conservation, if you like, and populations recovered a little. And then these black areas here are places where they've been reintroduced or introduced. In the case of Alaska, the last indigenous original ones disappeared in the 1800s, possibly because the last ones were hunted out by whalers or explorers. It's a little bit unclear exactly why the last ones disappeared. They weren't common for a while after they disappeared, so who knows. But now they're back in these various areas here. So the total worldwide numbers, this is a little approximate, 130, 140,000, maybe give or take 10,000. If you think about it, that's not a lot of animals for an entire species. You can have more than that in a single herd of caribou. So this is not a common species, which people in Nome sometimes forget about because, you know, when they're parked in your backyard, then you easily get the impression that there's too many of them. So how did they get back to Alaska? The original population, as I said, became extinct around 1860, give or take. And they were reintroduced by being shipped over here. Like 30 young animals were caught in Greenland and then shipped to Nunivag Island. This is a long, long odyssey that you could give an entire presentation about. And then from the Nunivag Island population, others were introduced to Western and Northern Alaska. So we have about 3,500 in Alaska today. Again, give or take a few 100,000. I'm not, you know, I don't have access to the very recent population numbers. And they're all descendants of those original 30. So people have brought up the question of inbreeding. Are they all each other's grandpas? And isn't that going to cause problems? Well, one would think, but it turns out muskoxen as a species have such a small genetic variability that they're all very much alike anyway. So they've gone in their evolution, they've had several bottlenecks that weeded out deleterious genes, and inbreeding under those circumstances seems to be a little less problematic than in other populations. So inbreeding does not seem to be a problem. Okay. This, by the way, is a photo I found somewhere of one of the original releases of those young animals on the Feather River, which is on the western side of the Seward Peninsula, near Nome, so on the road from Nome to Teller, halfway. That's where in 1970, and then I think again in 1981, animals were released, and from there they've spread over the Seward Peninsula. Okay, now let's talk about urban wildlife. Now it's worth noting that this is not a new phenomenon, but it is one that has in recent decades also really seems to be on the increase. Urban wildlife is a worldwide thing. You can, just about any species you can think of lives somewhere in a city and forages in a city. So why is all of this happening? It's probably always been happening to some degree, but these days more and more so, apparently. There could be tons of reasons why animals live in cities. Big ones are probably urban encroachment into the habitat of the animals. So they're losing their habitat, humans move in, and they simply adapt somehow and learn to deal with the situation and live among humans. They become habituated to humans in some way. So like, urban moose in Anchorage are a big deal, obviously. We've seen them walking down the street. so they're not afraid of people. And it's also possible, though, that the activity of humans creates certain habitats that might be useful to some animals. And that's, I think, what's happening in Nome. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that here in the next few minutes. So, next picture. So urban muskoxen might be so far a unique problem to our city. There are some native villages around the Western Alaska that have had muskoxen come into town. But as far as larger cities go, Nome is probably the only one on Earth that has an urban muskox problem. So it makes for, this article here is from 2011, and that's around the time when this started, or maybe a couple of years earlier. So it's about maybe 10, 15 years ago or so that this started to become more and more of a thing. So here they are camped out in the harbor. Here's our police chief. I think he's no longer there. He's gone, but there he was at the time. And here's a 10-foot pole, and he's trying to coax this rutting muskox bull out of somebody's backyard. And now this bull is in rut because, see, the colors are changing. So this picture's been taken in August or September, which is the rutting season. Yeah. So what are some of the problems we get that are caused by muskoxen? Lots of them, really. For years and years, lots of sled dogs have been attacked and injured or killed by muskoxen. So the mushers are really the people who have the biggest issues with them. And muskoxen really are very aggressive towards dogs. They don't like dogs. I think they might be thinking they're wolves, probably. And they go into, they've invaded dog lots and attacked the chained dogs on their chains. So the dogs really have no chance to escape. So it's really kind of ugly. There has been all kinds of traffic delays. There used to be constant flight, not constant maybe, but occasional flight delays at the airport when they were hanging out on the runway. So for a while, it wasn't so unusual to look out the window of your jet and see a herd of muskoxen on the runway. But now they built a fence around the entire airport, so that's no longer an issue. They got hit by cars. They have destroyed structures. You know, they get a little destructive sometimes, not often, but they've had butted things over. People are frightened to go berry picking when there's muskoxen in the area. And of course, I kept the worst for last. Last fall, for the first time ever, we had a person killed by a muskox in Nome. And this is him. This is Curtis Warland. He was a musher, among other things. And nobody knows exactly how it happened, but he was trying to, the muskoxen were near his kennel. He was trying to drive them away in a snow machine. And presumably at the time, the snow conditions were very difficult. The muskoxen probably couldn't run. Somehow he must have gotten too close and he got attacked. He got just one horn, I think, entered his leg, severed the femoral artery. So it's really a very tragic event. And as you can imagine, it's sort of, it got feelings run high in Nome right now about muskoxen. All right. There is a few, you could say, positive effects of the muskoxen in town as well. For one thing, it offers great viewing opportunity. So these are animals that live in very remote places elsewhere around the Arctic. And most places, you'd have to travel very far into very remote places to see them. But in Nome, you can observe them from your car, from the road system. So it attracts quite a bit of tourists. Cruise ships come into Nome these days, and one of the things they always want to see is the muskoxen. Some local businesses have, rely on getting tourists and showing them around, including seeing muskoxen. And we've had quite a few film crews come to film muskox footage. For example, Frozen Planet, both the first and the second series, have come to muskoxen to film, have come to Nome to film muskoxen there. And then they hire local people as guides or for the equipment rentals and things like that. So that brings a little bit of revenue to the city, I suppose. Okay, how do muskoxen react to stress? Well, this is sort of at the heart of some of the problems we get. Muskoxen, unlike other animals, unlike maybe reindeer or caribou, they're not very flighty animals. They're very energy conservative. So their idea is to always conserve energy, and they often can't afford to run very fast. So when they're put under stress, like when they're surrounded by predators, or when people try to drive them away from their neighborhood, they have a tendency to bunch up to do this, to kind of clump together, and then more or less the little ones maybe in the middle. And in this configuration, they get ready to defend themselves if they have to. And sometimes they run, but sometimes they don't. So scenarios where running is less likely is, for example, when they're stuck in deep snow, and walking or running through deep snow is extraordinarily difficult for them. They're not made for it. So then they may not be able to move. And then if you put pressure on them, they'll just bunch up. Sometimes they even just sit down when they're a little bit under siege, when they think they have to pay attention and there might be somebody who wants them harm. They might just all sit down on the ground, and it looks like they're very relaxed, but they're really not, because they're close together, hunkered together, ready to defend themselves. There it is. All right. Now,
It's only $45 a
town?
month
Sorry, was that a question?
for the unlimited
No,
jetpack.
Jennifer Adams, can you please mute yourself?
Oh, sorry. I thought it was a question. Yeah, okay. Okay, so why do they come into town?
I am
Um,
muted.
Yeah, a number of hypotheses are floating around. And the first thing that most people think about is bears. You know, there's lots of bears in the Nome area. Do they come into town to avoid bear predation? It's a good point, maybe. Bears, Fish and Game in Nome, they've presented on this at other occasions. They had a project, and still have, I think, radio coloring young muskoxen, and they find that a large number, maybe about half of them, are killed by bears. But it doesn't seem to look any better for those which are close to town. So superficially speaking, it doesn't look like being in town or close to town is going to protect you from bear predation. Bears certainly come right into the city limits as well. But muskoxen can react very, when bears attack a muskox herd, and I've sort of, seen the aftermath of that myself. It's pretty bad. I mean, they go in there in the spring when they've had babies, and they kill all the babies, every last one of them, with one bite each. Just mow them down. Don't even eat them. Just leave them lying around. Not sure why they do this, but the muskoxen can make very dramatic movements after that. It's very stressful for them, as you imagine. They might, scatter miles in all directions. And maybe that brought them to town at some point. Maybe that's how it started. Nobody really knows. But my study focuses on these other points here. What they do all day long is forage, right? They have to eat. And so even if they're in town for other reasons, if there wasn't anything to bite there, they would have to leave again. But we see them foraging with gusto all over town. So my study focuses on the habitat and the forage selection around Nome, especially sort of former mining areas. And then also a little bit on the phenology of plants. Well, I'll show you a little bit about this as well, how the snow melts a little bit earlier in Nome than in surrounding areas, and things might green up a little bit faster. So here's a quick overview of my project. It started out with a few very short, very simple undergraduate projects that were funded by BLAST or URSA. I've had several students work on those over a few years. And we collected a little bit of preliminary data on forage selection and habitat types and phenology. And using those data, I wrote a grant, NSF Teacup, small grant for research. And this is, we've had one field season. Oops, we're going to have one more. And these are sort of the things we're looking at. Basically to get a detailed assessment of how they use the habitat around town. Pretty much focusing on the growing season, so from May through September. And then our hypotheses to be tested, that disturbed areas, meaning areas where humans have somehow disturbed the ground, that they offer a better availability of those preferred forages than more natural tundra areas outside the city. And also a hypothesis about the phenology, that the activity in town causes an earlier snow melt and also an earlier green up of some preferred forages. And that is important for animals because right after the winter, they are somewhat depleted in their resources, especially the mothers who just had calves. They need protein and good forage to replenish their body reserves to make milk. So that early peak of good food might be very important for them. And then the second hypothesis here, to get a nutritional profile of the forages selected by muskoxen. So we're going to look at the nutritional value earlier versus later successional stages of forage on these recolonized disturbed areas. And also testing the hypothesis of whether plants that grow on mine tailings might have a better trace mineral, macro and trace mineral profile than plants growing elsewhere. Many other studies have shown that animals can be limited by certain minerals. For example, copper can be limiting for muskoxen. So maybe these mining areas, this mining soil has more of it. So these analyses are still pending. All the labs these days seem to be, understaffed, and everything seems to be taking a little longer. So I don't have those yet, but they'll come sooner or later. Here are some of the students that were involved. So, right, all right. So the mining history of Nome. Nome has been, when was the first gold strike? What was it, 1899 or 98 or something? So it's been 120, 125 years of mining. And the mining practice in Nome is placer mining, meaning that they basically scrape off large areas of ground. They run the dirt through a chute, and the gold kind of gets stuck in the little, gaps in the chute. And essentially today, they still use the same method. They just have modern, updated equipment. Here is one of the modern mines, and you can see, the big disturbance to the ground. So what happens? Like if go back here, what happens to all this area when they're done with it? We will see that right now it looks all barren and not very interesting, but the muskoxen are actually already in there. They'll be foraging here on these willows along the edges or here. But these areas will change when the mining is done and over. These bogs will fill up with vegetation. These denuded areas here will revegetate, and that's the kind of thing we're checking on. So mining does create habitat. This is one of those mining pits a few years on. And you can see there's green stuff in there. Most of this is horsetail, Equisedum fluviatile, also called water horsetail. It looks like grass, but it's not a grass. It's a plant more related to ferns. But I'll show you a slide on that in a moment here. It's very, very good stuff. And then here on these, back areas here, the miners will sow out grass seed to revegetate those areas. I think they're required by law to do something like that. And then you get these grasslands, which are really almost like a miniature, steppe or Serengeti almost, with like thick grasses growing on it. And you can see the muskoxen in the background. So that's the grocery store for them. Right. The patchinesses of habitats, this is just something new that I came up with recently. That's something I want to somehow, I haven't done the analysis yet. But the idea that near town, you have these small patches of ideal habitat, like here's a great little bog where you can eat horsetail, and maybe then you want to rest on the gravel where the wind blows the flies away, and maybe then you want to eat grass, and you can do all that without having to walk very far. Whereas tundra areas that are less disturbed outside of town, they tend to be more, the patches of habitat tend to be much larger. So maybe you have to spend more energy to get the same selection of forage than you would have in a much smaller area here in town. All right, here's a few data. The first we did was to just do simple visual observations. You have the advantage with these muskoxen in town that you can park a car right next to them and you can see very clearly what each animal is eating. You can see the actual plants they select and munch on, which is difficult to do with wild herds that you watch from a great distance through binoculars. You can sometimes not really see exactly what they're ingesting, but we were able to do that. And here are sort of the plants that are the most popular, really. The biggest are really willows and grasses. Willows grow pretty much everywhere around Nome, but maybe there's something special about the willows that grow near roadsides or mining areas. And then grasses are not that common on the tundra. There's rarely large expanses of grass. There's a few grass bits here and there. But on these revegetated and mining areas where the grass seed gets so scattered, what's that called, sown? Yeah, where they put out grass seeds. You've got huge grasslands. And then this is the horsetail, that is very special ecosidium that grows in these bogs. More about that in a moment. Sedge is, for those not familiar with it, it looks like a grass, but it's another kind of graminoid, a bit thicker, maybe coarser. And then later in the summer, you get 6 stands of fireweed as well on these revegetated areas, and they're very popular. They'll go in there and they'll just bite off the blossoms one after the other, like candy, I suppose. Here's a little graph that shows vegetation on areas that we call disturbed. So those are mining areas or roadsides versus more natural areas out on the tundra, which have at least not recently been disturbed. And the forages they like the most, like willows, grass, horsetail, they're all, more prevalent, more common on these so-called disturbed areas. Whereas tundra areas have a lot of ericaceous shrubs, which are things like evergreen shrubs like blueberries, cranberries, Labrador tea, etc., etc. These are all things that are not particularly nice to eat for muskox, and they have a lot of tannins and other chemical compounds in them. So more preferred forages in the areas near town that have been disturbed. So here's one of the couple of pictures of those horsetail bogs. By the pictures, by the way, it might not look like this is in town, but this is actually right at the corner here where you drive from the Dexter Bypass Road towards town. There's a big mine here, town in the background. And this is the bypass road that goes by the hospital. So the hospital is to the right and the police station right to the left of this picture. It's just looking north where there happens to be no houses here. But trust me, this is basically right in town here. And yeah, they're having a field day here in this tall grass looking stuff, but this is the horsetail, the water horsetail. Now here's 2 young bulls standing knee deep in the horsetail. Here's one of those bogs where they're all feeding. The water horsetail is very nutritious stuff. Like I analyzed the protein content of this stuff. Different bogs, like the red and blue, are data from Nome, and I threw in for kicks and giggles some data I collected many years ago in Deering when I did my master's there, but they fit right into the profile here. Early in the summer, when these things come up really fast, they have as much as 20–25% protein. I mean, that's basically like a lean steak. So that is an enormous early protein boost for these muskox, and particularly pregnant females. If you're thinking they just had calves, their body reserves are depleted from winter, they're making milk for the babies, and all of that costs a lot of energy, and they really have to find that first great peak of protein-rich forage. And in town, we got a ton of these bogs from old mining, and it's just a perfect place to go, really. You find these bogs elsewhere as well. I mean, the natural place where you might find these are old river arms, like old oxbow river arms that have been cut off and then are partially grown in. That's where you might find this kind of horsetail outside of Nome. But you have just a great density of these perfect little bogs everywhere, right, scattered around around town. What else do we have? Oh, yeah, here are these grassy grasslands that are, created by the miners when they put out grass seed. Here is an analysis of these grass seeds. I got this from Max Wagner, and I'm not sure if he's still there, but he was at some point working at the airport. This is a picture of the airport runway that I took out of the jet, and this grassy hill here, for a long time, was like the muskox bonanza. They were all this was taken obviously in winter, but in summer when the grass grows, they were all on there, and it's just a few steps away from the runway. So they were on there, and then when they'd be on the side of the runway, and all kinds of problems ensued, including, I guess, they got in trouble with the flight authorities or whatever. So nowadays there's a fence around the entire airport, so no more muskox problems there. But this is what that grassy hill looks like. It's basically, a dense lawn, if you like. Same here. And of course, people in town have lawns. But you can be sure that if you have a nice lawn like this, that sooner or later you're going to have some lawnmowers show up and take care of it. These pictures are all from fall. And if you look like here in the background, you see the tundra is mostly brown, the willows have gone brown and they become less attractive, probably less nutritious or less digestible at that point. But these nice lawns are still beautiful and green and lush. So great time of the year to go and eat some grass. All right. This is again a little preliminary data. Other data are still pending here. I'm going to get more data and more power analysis for the analyses eventually. But crude protein in young willows that are freshly coming up on recently disturbed areas. Those young willows, they tend to have a higher leaf to stem ratio, meaning larger, juicier leaves, fewer woody stems. And they tend to have a little more protein. This was not really significant, but it's sort of, the sample size was very small here. As I said, we have more analyses coming. And they tend to have fewer tannins, which make, older leaves probably a little less digestible or less palatable. So where do willows grow? Well, pretty much everywhere, but on newly denuded areas like this hill here, you'll have young willows coming up here, and they have these big fat leaves and very soft stems, so they grow fast, and they pioneer, newly disturbed ground. And then older bushes you might find on, like here in the background, these bushes are probably a little older. They have relatively smaller leaves, a little bit more tannins in there, maybe thicker stems. And here along the roadside, you might have some younger willows coming up. So you see them feeding on both kinds, but really they like the young willows particularly. So I did a little project on phenology, and we're going to do more this spring. And the idea was to basically see, well, how much faster do willows in town actually green up? So this is a student, Emma, she worked on that. So she had a project where she had some plots outside of town, some plots in town, in areas where muskoxen had been feeding, to see the timing of when the willow leaves greened out. And here's what she came up with. Like these, let's see, we have here, the red symbols are closer to town or even in town, and the blue ones are further away from town or sort of a few miles outside of town. And this is the percent green up, so the percent of how many of the spots on her on the bush. So she had like, a frame with like different spots that she viewed through. But anyway, how many were already green? And the main thing to point out is that in the early time of the green up here, the places near town are definitely greening up a bit faster. And if you draw a horizontal line to see when these out of town bits here catch up, it's somewhere around here maybe. So that's a difference of maybe, from about somewhere around May 20 to June 1st. So at least 10 days, maybe up to 2 weeks. It may be different in different years. Not every spring is the same. But those few days earlier might be a big incentive for the muskoxen to go to town. You want to eat. You want to get your nutrient peak as soon as you can. This is just a simple analysis that shows that, not surprisingly, there's nothing new or surprising about this, but that willow catkins as well as leaves are both higher in protein and both more digestible than the actual twigs. This is actually, the question is, can they eat twigs like moose? Well, yeah, they can, but does it give them a whole lot of nutrition? Probably not. So we like the leaves, and we like the willow catkins, which interestingly vary much more than the leaves in nutrient content. Possibly has to do with how far along they were, maybe. All right, so this is a view of Nome, like when you fly out with the jet. So I took this out of the window of the jet, and probably around this time, well, a little later, maybe around late April, early May or so. So in a typical year, what you can see is that most of the landscape here, well, first of all, this is Nome right here. A little hard to see the houses, but this might be Martinsonville. This is Icy View. And here is the high school area down here somewhere. So, but you can see that the landscape is mostly white back here, but around town, you have already more snow melt. So all the many roads, the many trails, human activity, it disturbs the ground, it makes snow melt faster, and it simply greens up faster. And the muskoxen, I think, will take advantage of that, because here's another view of the same thing. These hills north of town are sort of the typical wintering areas of muskoxen. So when you come to Nome during a typical winter, they might be sitting up here. This is Anvil Mountain. These are the so-called rabbit ears up there, the White Alice site, or here Newton on the other side. So they might be sitting up here on these hills. But these south-facing slopes here will melt out, and then you have these melting corridors that basically, melted ground, and it just leads them right into town. So if they can access the vegetation easily without having to dig through snow, well, so much the better. So I think the snow melt patterns may also be an incentive for them to induce them to come to town. Here's the same view from, this is what Nome looks like in summer. So these are wintering areas. Here's where the windmills are. This is Anvil. This is Newton. And they come down from these hills into these areas here, these areas here. The picture I showed you earlier was from right here, and occasionally even right into town. They've been right in the harbor, so we get around. Right. So a big part of my project is also outreach and education. So I've gone to a lot of the classes. I've gone to anywhere from kindergarten to the high school to talk to kids about the importance of being really careful about muskoxen. My worst nightmare has always been that if we ever have an accident with people, that it would be a kid. Kids play, and here's a little tyke on the stairs, and here's a muskox. What if they play, they run around the corner of a house, bump into a muskox gets startled, swings its horns just once. It could happen so easily. Muskoxen do not go out of their way to be aggressive towards people. Unlike dogs, they do go out of their way to be aggressive towards dogs, but not towards people. But as they become more and more accustomed to people, the distances decrease. People can easily get too close to them before a muskox reacts. And then when the muskox is startled or might feel itself attacked, then it could easily use that horn tip. So yeah, so far no kid has been hurt, but I want to make sure that the kids know that, well, if we have muskoxen in the neighborhood, what do? We go inside. We don't go anywhere near them. We watch out for them. And so we play games, we play muskox games where some of them get to be muskoxen and bunch up together, and some of them get to be wolves and go all around. So they have some fun with that and maybe learn a little bit about how muskoxen react. Now, I want to end this by talking a little bit about stuff I want to do in the future. And this, in recent winters, and particularly this winter, we've noticed in Nome that things are changing dramatically about snow conditions. And one thing that happens now is that we get far, far more rain in the winter than we used to. This last winter, virtually every single storm we've had, and we've had tons of them, at some point had rain in it. And then when that happens, it rains and the snow is wet, and then it freezes again. Right now it's like really cold in Nome. We suddenly have like a record cold for April. But then the snow gets rock hard, like concrete. So now the snow is very thick, and it has these layers of ice in it, which makes it so hard, it becomes impossible for the muskoxen to dig through. So I've noticed in recent winters that they've changed the way they forage in the winter. So for example, this is pictures from long ago, from when I did my master's research. This is what a typical muskox winter range looks like. It's some high hilltop where the wind blows the snow away. The snow in the winter, you know how it is when it's cold and dry, right? It's like powder. It just gets blown away, and it exposes part of the ground. And the snow is very shallow and pretty soft, and they can just push it away with their noses and, get at the vegetation underneath. So this is like a typical muskox winter range. But this winter around Nome, the snow is everywhere, and it's rock hard, and there's ice and ice and ice in it, several layers, and it cakes down on the vegetation, and it's become impossible for them to dig through that in their typical winter ranges. So typically you'd have them up here on a hill like this, on a wind-blown ridge top, but now they've come down further down the slopes to feed on even above snow willows like these. So you can see them gnawing on willow bushes like the way a moose would feed. And they can do that, but I'm not sure they get a lot of nutritional value out of that. And you've seen my analysis of twigs really not being very nutritious. A moose has a different digestive flora and can probably deal with it better. So I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that this is not very ideal for them. It's like a cop-out. It's a last resort. And we saw a group here. This is near my home in Banner Creek here, or this is at, near there. And here's an area where they've been cratering, and you can see that they've dug through these really hard crusts here. There are probably times of the day when the snow is less hard, like after it's been baked by the sun for a few hours. But these edges of these craters were like, you could have stomped on there with like an iron pole and not chip it off. It was so hard. And there's not much in there. You can see they've bitten down these few sedges here, very much down to the ground level. So I want to include some future research. I'm trying to write another grant for that to see how both muskox and hopefully I'll include reindeer as well, how they deal with these changing snow conditions, including some nutritional data that looking into what they actually get out of this new feeding regime here, if anything, and also some behavioral observations to see what the social dynamics are of feeding in a place like this. Who digs the craters? Who gets the benefit of what's in the craters? That's just a few bites here after a lot of work digging this crater. Who took those bites? So who gets the goodies and who doesn't? So that to me is like an interesting question that I want to investigate in the future. So I want to do my acknowledgements here. Okay, where are we? Oh, hang on. Previous there. So yeah, as I said, we've started out with a few Ursa and Blast summer research projects for various students. Here are all the students who in some way or another have been involved so far. Most of them had short summer projects, some of them working on this next field season as well. And then NSF is currently funding this project. And of course, pop-up is the great fecal sample locator. Always good to have along. Yeah, that's all I have here. So if you have questions, please fire away.
Yeah, I can actually field some of the questions for you and help facilitate our remaining time. Thank you so much for that presentation, Claudia. It was very, very interesting.
Yeah, sure.
Do muskox become accustomed to places? So for example, if they're accustomed to being at the Nome Cemetery, will they continue to come back to that particular location?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I think that muskoxen are, yeah, I think they have this thing where they just become familiar with a place and they keep going back to the same place. You can see them in the exact same places over and over again. Because I think, if they already know they're going to get what they want there, why run around and look elsewhere, right? I mean, it's kind of like when you go to a grocery store and milk is in aisle 9 and that's what you need. That's straight where you go. You're not going to run around, everywhere. It saves energy and time for them to go to familiar places.
Okay. Do muskox vary from place to place in terms of behavior among themselves and with nearby human communities?
That is a very good question. Do muskoxen vary? I mean, genetically, not so much. I mean, there are slight differences between, say, the muskoxen that live in Alaska versus the ones in Canada. The Canadian ones are a little bigger. They have darker faces. But I think genetically, there's not a whole lot of difference there. Do they vary in terms of behavior? Probably not drastically, but I think part of the behavior will also be determined by the demands of the environment. For example, the density, is there a high density of animals or lower density of animals? So that might change a little bit on how they form groups, how they bulls and rut look for females. So there might be some subtle differences there. But on the whole, I think muskoxen anywhere are very much alike in the way they behave.
Okay. How do other animals populations interact with muskoxen? I think we heard about the dogs. The dogs are not not good interactions with the muskox and the bears as predators. But how about other populations in that region? Like, and I'm curious as well, like with the reindeer or the caribou, like do they intermingle? Threat?
Well, they don't really intermingle. I actually did my master's research on the question of whether muskoxen and reindeer compete for forage with one another, and I kind of came to the conclusion, not really. They might go to some similar places, but they don't seem to interfere with one another. The reindeer focusing more on lichens, the muskoxen more on graminoids. And I didn't see a whole lot of any deleterious interaction between them. I've seen once a friend and I actually saw a muskox group that had been joined by one lone reindeer. But I've seen that only one time. A yearling reindeer that traveled with a muskox group, which was interesting. And we don't know really what happened there. Maybe it got separated from a reindeer group and it didn't want to be alone and just kind of hung out with the muskoxen. So we followed it around for a few hours and that's all we ever saw of it. So, yeah.
Do you think the active mining and professional thawing of the permafrost near Nome helps with the early thaw or travel routes into town?
Well, the mining definitely, because anytime you have roadways or trails or snow machine trails, it's just like it sort of changes the snow in such a way that I think it can melt more easily along the edges. It creates edges, and snow melt usually starts at some kind of an edge and then progresses. So wherever you have a lot of trails crisscrossing, I think snow melt will be sped up once the sun becomes more intense and gnaws away at those edges that are created. So I think in that sense, mining will definitely, create more snow melt. Is that Gay having a thing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
if I could just follow up, because it's a really interesting, because it's come up with the birds, why is Nome, we've always got the birding first, right, in Nome, and it's been brought up, and so I really liked your travel route thing and great presentation. But when they took the steam pipes and literally thawed the permafrost out of Nome, that somehow has maybe changed us a little bit so that we are not as cold when it comes to melting. So I didn't know if that's kind of what I was getting at, if that's something that's ever come up in your
saying that maybe the soil is even a bit warmer around Nome. And so that's something one could investigate. I'm actually, I'm trying to get some money for my earthworm research too. That would involve soil loggers to measure temperature. One could stick a few around Nome and find out. Yeah.
Awesome. Because I think they did just hammer the permafrost to get at the gold, to get the dirt.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Anyway, thanks.
Yeah.
Are the muskox affected by lots of noise, say in town with the traffic or mining noise?
Yeah. That was another interesting question. I think they just kind of get habituated to it. They just get used to it. I mean, they used to feed right next to the runway at the airport. So apparently the planes taking off and landing didn't bother them that much. I think this is true of all urban wildlife. They can become habituated to those kinds of things. Certainly when you hang out near the muskoxen in Nome and then go somewhere far afield where there's muskoxen that don't see people, there's a huge difference in how tolerant they are to noise or to how close you can get to them. Those urban animals, they're veterans of city life and they've seen it all. And I think they can get accustomed to the noise, the traffic, the roads, everything.
Yeah. I feel that way with moose in Fairbanks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've seen the urban moose in Anchorage that are hanging out in people's backyards. It's probably the same thing. They just got used to it. Whether it causes them some stress on some level, I'm not sure. Good question. It's known from studies in humans that living in a noisy place, even if you're habituated to it, causes some kind of stress. That it's better to be someplace where it isn't noisy, but it's probably, something they just got used to. Yeah.
Are any of the muskox around town tagged, or are they tracked regularly?
Oh yeah, Fish and Game has quite a few tags, meaning radio collars on some animals. And they had this study, and they've had presentations on it where they followed muskox. They tagged young muskox calves, and then to see what their mortality is. And yeah, a lot of them get nailed by bears. But yeah, and they regularly take down the locations of muskox, and they fly and track them from the air. So they have all that.
Okay. Do muskox ever eat soil/dirt looking for salt or other minerals?
It's a good question. Good question. I think most herbivores do that occasionally to get certain minerals. I haven't once or twice in my life. Yeah, I've seen muskox apparently eat some soil. I haven't really seen it around Nome. But that's why I'm waiting for my mineral analyses to see if maybe minerals are good in those plants that grow on mine tailings. Animals elsewhere, like, other ungulates like sheep or horses or whatever, they've been known to eat mineral or soil when they were deficient in certain minerals to try to make up for it. So I'm sure muskoxen do it too here and there occasionally, but I haven't seen like a really obvious instance of that around Nome, not yet.
Okay. And looks like the final question that we have, do the muskox in town you study recognize you and your researchers?
No, they don't recognize me personally. But
you don't pet them?
No. We don't. In fact, the very first thing my students get is a very stern lecture on how to take them seriously, because we don't want anybody get nailed. We've just had that one fatality, which, I should say, it is probably, well, it's certainly the first time ever in Alaska that somebody was killed by a muskox, and maybe the first time ever anywhere, because honestly, I'm not aware of any other story of somebody being killed by a muskox. It was a very unfortunate event. And as I said, muskoxen don't go out of their way to be aggressive towards people, but the potential always exists with any big animal. So no, we don't go anywhere near them. We don't pet them. It's a habitat study, so it's not about going close to the animals. We watch them from the car occasionally, and sometimes we're lucky enough to be really close in a car. So we're sitting in the car looking out the window, and that's when the muskox is only a few feet outside your car. You can really clearly see how they forage and what they eat. But muskoxen in captivity, they get very personable. I used to work at the muskox farm in Fairbanks as a student, and I took care of animals, and I bottle raised a whole bunch of them. And and they certainly, I'm sure they knew me. Certainly the ones I bottle raised. There was one called Ingrid. She was my big baby, and she'd come running out of the woods even as a 2-year-old to come and greet me when I came. So she certainly knew who I was. It's long ago.
That's so nice. I will say that baby muskox have got to be one of the cutest things.
Yeah, they are. And they are. And, when I bottle raised a few of them long ago at Lars, it's like they bonded to me, and I think I bonded to them as well. So when they started bawling at 3 in the morning and I had to go out there at 4 a.m. At 3 in the morning at 40 below to feed them their bottle, I didn't mind one bit, because I just loved them, and little little things, and they're just terribly cute. Yeah.
They are. Well, thank you so much, Claudia. This is like a really engaging and interesting topic that we got to share. So
yeah, and there'll be more more of it once I have all the analysis and another field season. I can probably give a more comprehensive presentation. At this point, some of the data are still a little scanned, but they'll be coming in. Yep.
all right. Well, we'll be on the lookout. Well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining us. This is our last speaker series for the academic year, so we might be picking it back up in the fall. But it's just a perfect presentation to close this out for the academic year. So again, thank you so much, Claudia.
Okay, yeah. And if any of you ever show in Nome, let me know, and you can look me up and I can show you the critters. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.